Welcome once again to the Poker Media Australia PMA podcast. I'm your host, Ben Blashke, joined as always by the effervescent Landon Blackhall. Landon, how are you going?
Very well. Effervescent. I feel like I should be sipping a Schweppes right about now after that intro. Thanks, mate.
Wanted to throw in something vibrant for you on this sunny Sunday afternoon.
And of course, Sunday afternoon, a very happy Mother's Day to all the mums, no matter where you are. Hope you're all very safe and well. But Ben, what's been happening on your part of the world this week?
Not a lot, just been trying to get through the latest week of the shutdown and getting a bit of itchy feet now, wanting to get out and go to a cafe or a restaurant or a bar or a pub or something. Moods are different every day. Sometimes it's great to be in shutdown. Sometimes it's a bit frustrating.
I think we're just pretty much all on edge right now. The end is almost in sight. We're seeing that the federal government's starting to relax a lot of these restrictions across all the states and territories. And so for us, obviously, as a poker industry, it means that, you know, we're getting closer to hopefully one day getting back to the game that we love so much. But, you know, seeing those pictures, particularly the one that was posted on the PMA Facebook page with the plastic screens around that 10-seater poker table, it just makes you wonder, is all that effort and all that perspex really worth it? Or should we just stick to the online game? So in saying that, we have a very special guest with us who might be able to give a little bit more insight as to what's happening with the online poker scene in Oz.
Yeah, Joseph, how are you doing?
Yeah, very well. Thank you very much. And Landon, thank you and congratulations on that smooth segue into introducing me. It was very nicely done. It's certainly an exciting time, for Australia and the world at the moment, but also for the poker industry as we look at what does this current change look like as we get back to the new normal, as everyone calls it, and what does that mean for online poker and the regulation of that in this country, which is obviously something that I, through the Australian Online Poker Alliance, have had a fair bit to do with over the past couple of years. So certainly exciting to see where all the moving parts land, and it's great to be here to have a chat with you both about it today.
Joey, of course, you're a very well-known figure within the Australian poker scene. You've been around the game for a number of years now. But for those who may not know you as well as others, for those who might be new to the game or aren't as involved as we are, just tell us a little bit about your background and, first of all, how you got involved in poker in general, and then how you got about to starting the Australian Online Poker Alliance.
So, look, poker for me, like many people, when I first started at university, I was a student at UNSW, and the Roundhouse there had a regular poker game on, and I found myself spending more time there playing cards and meeting those guys and having a good time than I did studying, and that sort of is where my love of the game started and grew from there. I have found that even though I wasn't playing the game as regularly, the love and the passion for it had always remained. And keeping in touch with the game and keeping in touch with people involved in the game, saw about a few years ago, after talking to some people, seeing some changes happening in the online poker legislation, being the Interactive Gambling Act. And was sort of then invigorated to get involved in trying to start up and fight for the rights for Australian citizens and residents to be able to play online poker in a safe and legal format.
It's a long and amazing story, actually, Joey. It's a lot of work, and you've done a lot of this work yourself over the years with the Australian Online Poker Alliance. I know it's been, I'm pretty amazed at just what you've been able to achieve and how much work you've done on it over that time. It's too much to go through everything you've done, but just give us a bit of a background on what you've done in terms of working with government, liaising with government, liaising with various stakeholders. What's been involved and what sort of progress has been made in general over that time.
It actually was quite interesting. My career prior to starting the Online Poker Alliance was more or less sculpted to be ready for that. I've always had a love of poker, and it's always been a passion of mine that I've enjoyed throughout my entire adult life. It's been a really interesting ride, for me. I, as I said, was very heavily involved in poker as a player, and then as other life and work commitment got larger, I found having less time to play, but still very much kept involved in the community, particularly with when a lot of the work I was doing in the reporting and media space there just sort of kept me quite involved with a lot of the players, and obviously friendship that were formed. I kept in touch with many of them. Now, and in the time that I wasn't playing, my work background has really put me in a position where I guess I was really in a fortunate position to help in this cause. I've done a fair bit of work in media and public relations, as well as knowing and understanding poker quite intimately. And also I have worked quite extensively in politics and for both federal and state governments and oppositions, which has helped me to really understand the parliamentary process and what's required to get something from being a good idea into being a law. And so, look, I sort of saw, talking, to players in the community, that there was a large upswell of people that were concerned that the amendments to the Interactive Gambling Act in, I believe it was 2017, but don't quote me, were really ruining our rights to play poker. And a lot of people felt quite helpless. And I just felt, with my background in those sort of areas that I've mentioned, and I was in a position to really be able to help and try to get at least make it give us a chance in the fight, make sure our voice was heard. So what we were able to do, getting people together and building a bit of mass, I was able to start talking to members of the government and of the opposition about poker. And this had a two-stage thing. One was, which I first found, was the process of actually explaining to members of parliament what poker is. I can tell you of probably 100 different members of parliament that I've spoken to about this issue. Easily over 80% of them thought when I was talking about online poker, I was talking about online pokies or poker machines or slot machines. Because obviously, being the only country in the world that calls them poker machines, there's a correlation between the two in a lot of people's heads, where we know them to be very, very different. So a lot of it was, to start with, really an education piece about explaining what the differences were and why poker is a game which is different for the key reasons, obviously, of you're not playing against the house. The house is providing a service so the players can play against themselves, and opposed to being a game where you are mathematically programmed to lose. It is a game which, yes, it does have luck in a short-term capacity, but it is a skill game over a long period of time, and a more skillful player will win overall, making it a different proposition to your standard house casino games. So I sort of found that was, I guess, one of the first parts, really explaining that difference, to members of parliament, and then once people understood the difference, then going to explain what the benefits are of having regulated online poker in Australia. And look, one thing we've seen currently, which really highlights the proof is in the pudding, we're seeing an absolute massive rise in illegal online gambling in Australia at the moment. And that's happening both in poker and in online casino games and the like. I think something like numbers are up on 67% growth in illegal online gambling, which makes very clear, firstly, that the current status of prohibition hasn't worked, because for something to grow by 67%, it started from a non-zero base. So people are doing it anyway. And now that they're at home and they've lost the ability to go to their local pub, club or casino, they're doing it online. And so if we're looking at a situation and seeing that prohibition is not working, well, then we may as well look at what can we do to protect players. And that's where the logic and the argument for why online poker should be regulated is very clear, has always been very clear, and remains very clear. If people are going to do it, we need to provide a safe, regulated environment for them to do it. We need to ensure that players are playing in spaces and with operators that are good actors and not bad actors, and that will do their part to ensure there are mechanisms in place to protect vulnerable and members of society that play. And that is, unquestionably much better handled by large corporate publicly listed entities that have shareholders and stakeholders that simply won't stand for shady, irregular practices. So it's about bringing it into the white space and into the public light, so that things can be seen very clearly and monitored and acted professionally. There is also the very, very clear argument. We're seeing spending by government, which is completely unprecedented in Australia's history, needed to happen, obviously. And the amount of all these different announcements and all of this money being given out by the government, this is going to take generation after generation after generation to pay back. We are digging a very large hole in our economy through this. Obviously, though, there are benefits to the economy, but now is very clear that there is a time that we do need to have additional streams of government revenue. And if people are doing this, if there's hundreds of millions of dollars being gambled illegally online with unscrupulous operators, surely it is much better to bring that into a safe public environment where it is regulated, players are protected, and those revenues are going to the government from a tax perspective, as opposed to being sent out into black economies around the world. And then the other clear argument to make is simply an act of freedom. I am very proudly Australian. I am very pro-freedom as an individual. I think it's a good idea, being free. And I have a pretty simple adage that I am pretty happy for an individual to decide what is best for them, as opposed for a government forcing them one way or the other. So I think that is a very clear argument there, the rights of Australians to choose. I don't think a prohibition approach where we are saying, no, you cannot play, you are not allowed to play, we know what's best for you. I think obviously it is much better to be saying, you are able to play. If you have any problems, here are a whole list of safeguards or things that you can do for us to assist you. These arguments were things that we've put forward to both government and opposition, and they have been, I think, roundly understood and agreed. But that, I guess, has been the main part was getting that education process done and explaining what the benefits were and why poker should be legalized in Australia. Then, obviously, once you've got everyone on the same page of doing it, it's then putting it into law. We worked well across multiple parties in the parliament and had a Senate inquiry into online poker held, which was fantastic, and we were able to give some submissions to that and motivate and activate the Australian poker community to take part. And it was really good to see the way the Australian poker community got involved. Actually, if you look through the Hansard report, there's a quip from Senator Fifield, who was the minister at the time for communications. He did actually sort of point out that one reason he was happy to be having the debate in Parliament now is that it meant that his social media streams would stop being attacked by the online poker community, who were tweeting and messaging every day, which again, that was some of the things that we were organising, activation campaigns of getting poker playing community. I think there are a lot of people that don't know poker and haven't been part of the community and don't understand just how poker is this amazing game. When you're sitting at a table with someone for a long period of time and you're talking to them, you really build a bond with these people, and it is a very large family feeling to the poker community. And so a lot of people might look at something like online poker legislation and think, oh, this is just big business trying to push this through because they want more money. But no, this has been a completely community-led movement. It has been solely poker players standing up and trying to get their voice heard and get the ability and the right to play their game in Australia. I mean, I've spoken to literally thousands and thousands of poker players over my time doing this. They're city people, they're country people, they're young people, they're old people, they're men, they're women, they're family people. There's people that want to play online because they're disabled and they don't want to have to go to a pub or club. There's someone, they live 2 hours away from their nearest venue, so they want the ability to be able to play online. There is not just one simple group of people that wants to do this. It is really indicative that poker is a game that is widespread, is played by all walks of life, is enjoyed by all walks of life, and is played much more prevalently as a hobby and a form of social enjoyment than it is for any financial purpose.
I wanted to touch back on what are perhaps some of the challenges that you faced trying to promote the Australian Online Poker Alliance to players. I know that particularly with movements like this, there tends to be, I think, an underlying sense of apathy from a majority of players that simply don't want to put in the time and effort to get behind causes like this. Is that something you've come across during your time with the Alliance?
There was not one Australian poker player that I spoke to that wasn't supportive. But I do think, as you point out, saying that you're supportive of something and actually doing something is often a far bridge for people, and rightly so. Everyone has things in their life. It's of varying degrees of importance to different people. So part of that, for me, when setting up the Online Poker Alliance was, how do we make this as simple as possible, to make some noise? And that was where setting out daily call to actions of what we wanted people to do. And then we were using automated scripts where effectively send a tweet out to 5 different MPs on that day that we were targeting. They had to press a button and the tweet was populated and sent on their behalf. So when it comes to doing anything significant, it can sometimes be hard. It was actually a hard thing, with the Senate inquiry that we had, getting people to make submissions. A lot of people had stuff they wanted to say. They just weren't particularly comfortable in writing it or in putting it forward. And they, some people that were afraid that they couldn't write or speak eloquently enough to do that. And I kept explaining to people, this isn't a grammar test. This is about you putting your emotions and your feelings in place. And I think one thing too that we have seen is when I first started this, people thought we had absolutely no chance of getting poker back. And I was quietly confident. I was confident that we had a strategy and a plan in place that would work. And I feel vindicated. It's taking longer than it should have, but I mean, things like global health pandemics and bushfires ravaging the entire east coast of the country, make things a little difficult. But I'm still very confident that the conversation has shifted from being if we will see online poker regulated in Australia to when will we see online poker regulated in Australia. But yeah, I think as well at the start for a lot of people it seemed a bridge too far and a mission impossible. And I did sort of find that a lot of people that were supportive but I guess passive initially, once they started seeing some movement, when they started seeing some media being generated, when they started hearing MPs talking about it, when they saw Senate inquiries being launched, people actually started to look and feel, say, hey, wait, this is actually something real here. And that obviously motivates people to get more involved.
I think it's worth pointing out to our viewers and listeners who may not have completely followed the history of online poker in Australia, just take them back a couple of years. Of course, for a number of years, online poker, I guess, existed in a sort of a grey area in Australia where it was quasi-legal, really. Nobody ever really bothered to address it. And then, as you say, the amendment to the Interactive Gambling Act, I can't remember if it was like 17 or 18 at the moment, it was a couple of years ago. That wasn't even targeted at online poker. It was targeted at effectively banning illegal offshore operators from providing services to Australians, and online poker was caught up in the mix, I guess.
We were collateral damage. You make such a good point, and it is further proof and evidence as to why it makes sense for regulation. So if you look before the amendments in, let's just go with 2017 and apologise if we're wrong. If you look back to pre the recent amendments when online poker was, want for a better word, quasi-legal and living in a grey space. We had the party pokers, the poker stars, the large publicly listed operators operating in Australia, and all the responsible gaming measures in place, all of the accountability and protection in place for their players. As soon as these amendments were made in 2017, and poker was then deemed to be illegal, we saw those sites that had previously been acting in good faith and good conscience, we saw them all leave the market. And what we saw instead come in was a group of different sites. And I'm not here to name and shame people, but I think it was literally the day after the amendment passed, I got an email from a poker site that I had never played on and never heard of before. So talking about unscrupulous practices, I have no idea where they got my information from. But promoting the Good Day Australia tournament series that they were having to launch. And it was as soon as the good operators left the market, it just got flooded with a large number of companies that were solely looking for an environment that they could operate in that didn't have the large legal compliant competitors. And it just sort of, it showed that when that change happened, it was a real clear shift in the market, that the companies that were loud and proud and public, and all of their financial figures and data are reportable because they're publicly listed companies, as soon as they all moved out, they were replaced by various forms of entities that didn't see, Australia's changed their legislation, that means we can't operate. That means, great, Australia changed their legislation. The people that want to do the right thing are going to move out of the market. That means there's a clear opportunity for us to come in and try to fill that void.
My question to you, Joey, I mean, we're obviously seeing all these unscrupulous sites come in to flood the market and to fill that void, as it were. We're also seeing a very similar pattern emerging on a much broader scale in the United States as well. Given that this is so similar to everything that was leading up to Black Friday back in 2011, are you concerned that something like that is going to happen again?
It's an interesting question, and we all still remember the vivid scenes of turning on your computer and having an FBI logo, where your favorite poker site at the time's logo once was, and that being a bit confronting. Whether that will happen here or not, it's sort of a different process. And one thing to make very clear is, for Australian players, the players themselves aren't at risk, and by definition of Australian law, aren't doing anything wrong. It is the operators that are doing the wrong thing. But it is, and it, I guess, is the point that is highlighted from whether or not the exact same thing occurs or not. If you're dealing with someone that is acting illegally, and you have and if that company, for example, is not based in Australia, which none of them are because they legally can't be based in Australia, all of a sudden has your money and then decides, actually, we're not going to operate anymore and we're not going to give you your money back, you have little to no recourse to do anything because they're outside of Australian jurisdictions. They're operating outside of Australian law. There are very little protections that are in place for you to support you there. So, the risks are the same here now as they were then. There is no recourse for players if sites do anything wrong because there is no regulatory body to make sure that operators are acting ethically. And yeah, so absolutely, there are concerns that the players should be aware of. Players themselves aren't doing anything wrong playing on those sites, but I mean, you are fueling companies that are doing the wrong thing by doing that.
Now, you ran through before a whole heap of reasons as to why you believe online poker should be legalised and regulated in Australia, and I personally agree with each of them. In terms of the arguments you're presenting to people when you talk to them, you said that you've been on an education program basically with a lot of the key decision makers. Is there one argument or one or two arguments more than others that you feel gain more traction in particular?
Yeah, unquestionably is the responsible gambling side and protection to players, and rightly so. That is really the name of the game, because at the moment, why, and I made very clear that look, the reason that 80% of MPs that I've spoken to had no idea what online poker was, that's not a problem, or that's not a damning of them. I mean, you don't just instantly become an MP and know everything about every matter. We're a subset of Australian culture, and there are many subsets out there that it's impossible for MPs to know about everything. It's about them to act in good faith once they have the correct information in front of them. Now, when you look at the reason why has Australia decided to ban online gambling, there is clearly as a country we don't mind the idea of gambling, but a decision has been made by the government that it is the best way to protect Australian players. That's the main idea behind it. So when you show that the prohibition that is currently in place doesn't work because people are playing anyway, your intent of why you are putting in this legislation is to protect vulnerable Australians. Well, that's not working. The only way to protect players is to provide a safe regulatory framework in which operators can operate and have a set of guidelines in place that allow them to put protections in place. There is obviously revenue is important to all governments. No government is usually going to just get up and say, we're only doing this for the money. So that is why that argument, although is valid and is now more valid than ever, just given the size and scope of the stimulus that's been required for the Australian economy and the kickstart that the Australian economy is going to need post-coronavirus. That is a very valid argument. But the main reason the regulation is required is to protect players and to make sure that frameworks are in place so that those that choose to gamble online, and it is a choice of an individual, it shouldn't be the choice of the government, but those who choose to make that choice, if they need help and assistance and protection, that Australia is able to provide that in full force. So to protect not only vulnerable Australians, but to protect anyone that plays and ensure that if there are any disputes or any reason to have protection of the monies put forward by Australian players, then you need to have a Australian regulatory body to look at and examine that. It's as simple as that.
My other question to you, if we were to establish online poker in Australia, would it be better to perhaps incorporate online poker regulation within the existing state government framework, or would it require the establishment of a federal governing body?
Yeah, and this is a great question. It's actually one of the things I spent a lot of time with the Minister's office looking at this when we were originally having the conversation, because it's sort of one of those things where looking at it as the federal government, all governments are Australian and they all operate in the best interest of Australia. But obviously, federal governments like to see federal revenue and state governments like to see state revenue. And so this was sort of one thing that federally, setting up a national regulatory governance over this space would allow those revenues to flow into federal coffers. However, the work involved in doing that, and then the crossing toes, so to speak, with the state governments that do all the licensing and legislation of sports betting, horse racing, and some lotteries in the country, that made that sort of problematic. So let me jump back a step. So you need to be licensed in Australia, and the state governments provide licensing. Well, they have the option to. Predominantly Northern Territory, Tasmania, and Queensland are the main guys that do it. You need to have an Australian gaming license to provide services to Australian customers. So then a lot of people said, well, why don't the poker sites get licenses? The way the federal government law is written prohibits those sites from getting licenses. So that's where we've sort of looked at it and decided the easiest way around this is let's not step on the toes of the states. The states already have licensing frameworks in place. Let's use the existing licensing frameworks that exist, and let's look for an amendment in the federal legislation to allow the states to do that. So that's where quite simply we were looking at and still are looking at a small amendment to the Interactive Gambling Act federally, which would allow states the opportunity to then go and license. So if you're sitting at home thinking you want to be a poker operator one day in the future when it is regulated, not to go to the federal government and say, I want a license for poker, they don't do it. They will merely change their law to allow the states to do it.
I guess we should get to the $1 million question at the end of it all, Joey, is that you mentioned before the conversation has shifted now from if online poker will be regulated in Australia to when it will be regulated in Australia. So what's the answer to that question? When will online poker in Australia be regulated?
Are you setting a line or,
Would you like to find a friend or use a 50-50?
I was very confident this time last year that the end of this financial year, it would occur. Now, we've had a unbelievably Australian 12 months as far as managing a government goes. Now, and if you look back, and it's amazing how long ago this seems now, from having a Turnbull government facing by-election after by-election and losing, seeming destined to lose government, to then a federal election where, again, when Scott Morrison was a leader and it seemed like he would lose government, to not losing government, to then having some of the worst and most horrific bushfires, which should absolutely not be downplayed in any way, shape or form, ravage the east coast of this country, to now the biggest health pandemic of our lives by far, and many generations of Australians' lives. It is impossible to find any breathing space on the legislative agenda. The week the lockdown had started in Australia, I was set to go in to Minister Fletcher, the Communication Minister's office, to start looking at timeline sort of considerations and discussions. But the advisor that I was meeting with there, I sort of had a chat to her, and obviously you guys have pressing things to deal with at the moment, so let's put a pin in it and readdress it in a few weeks when you sort of have some breathing room. And I think, and these are the right things to do. And I've had, with some of the Australian poker players, and I think one thing actually I will address, because a lot of people are saying, look, now is the time. Surely we're all at home in lockdown. Let's make these changes now. It's actually not possible now, in the sense that if we had every single member of the Australian Parliament completely in agreement that we should change this and regulate and allow online poker in Australia today, there simply isn't a parliamentary framework operating in the country at the moment to allow that to occur, because we have suspended the normal standard parliamentary sitting periods and replaced them with looking at stuff to handle the coronavirus pandemic. So there are two sort of things that, as a group, and what I've sort of suggested to people is, we as poker players, whilst now might seem like a great time because we're all at home, to go and say, hey, let's push for this right now. You don't really want to be the guys that are arguing for your vested interest at a time where the entire globe is looking at survival. And so I think that was a key thing. And that sort of is why we delayed the meeting at the start. Now I think, whilst we're getting to a stage now where we're on the road, back to recovery, and we're looking at what the next steps are, now is the time to start the conversation, which we have done. And I've actually got a meeting this coming week with the Minister for Social Services, Senator Ruston. And so we will be having sort of that same conversation there, just to see what is going to be the best way to bring this in and what's going to be the best timeline. I would assume we will need a few months post-coronavirus for this to happen. So I think it's probably going to end up costing us a year in the sense of it. But I would say by the end of next financial year, I would be very, very, very surprised if we weren't playing, online poker in Australia in a regulated market.
I think there's not a single poker player in Australia that wouldn't be very excited, and you may have just raised everybody's hopes way beyond anything now, Joey. So good for that. What I heard was Joey said by 1st of July next year we will definitely be playing on poker. That's all I hear.
I remember I've worked in politics. I know never to actually promise anything. That's the
exactly. Yeah, just sort of flirt around the edges.
Yeah.
There's a fair bit of irony, isn't there? I mean, just before we finish up, this COVID situation globally is a terrible tragedy, terrible situation that we're all going through. I mean, Australia's not experiencing it anywhere near it. We certainly aren't as bad as many other countries. We're one of the lucky ones, I suppose, who have handled it well. But it's ironic that we may actually look back and this situation may just be that little extra step to push online poker legislation over the edge there, because there's no doubt, as you say, the 67% rise in online gambling that took place in the space of a week, I think, once the shutdown started. And we know that wasn't sports betting because there's no sport to bet on. So, if anything, you can back up the arguments that you're talking about. It's just this whole COVID situation has proven that. So we may end up looking back in 10 years' time at the history of online poker in Australia, and COVID will be one of those moments.
And it really will. And look, and I think it's actually a great point. And not just for poker, but this is the economy as a whole. I mean, these world-shifting moments, this is where you look for the silver lining in these things. This is a horrible thing that's happening, and there are many people that are having some extremely tragic experiences, and not making any light of that at all. That is very serious and needs to be managed. But this is where innovation and agility of business comes into place, and this is where we look at what the new normal is and how do businesses shift. Look at an example I saw. I never go to McDonald's, obviously, but someone went and told me now they sell fresh bread and milk through drive-through. Now, how clever is that, right? Like, that's just looking at a landscape and looking at, okay, the landscape is shifting. What does this mean for us? And what does this do? We're going to see some significant changes off the back of. There's 3 stages. There is the way we used to live, the way we're living at the moment, and before we get back to where we were, there's going to be a period in between where, when pubs and clubs open up and casinos open up, they're not going to just turn on and be back at max capacity straight away. So it is now up to business like that to look at things smarter and to look at how can they benefit the most in these times. And some of the stories you hear about things that people have done and the way they've shifted their business to adapt to the current landscape is phenomenal. So yes, this overall experience is tragic, but we will find benefits as a nation, and it's going to be the way businesses adapt. And it is, and I think, as you're saying, for the point on our side of things, you can't look at online gaming anymore and say it doesn't exist. For any government to say that prohibition works and we are banning online gambling and that is the right thing to do, it is a complete head in the sand comment to make now. There is too much data and too much evidence that proves otherwise. So as the economy shifts and as social distancing and things like that mean people aren't as close to each other in a physical sense as they once were, it's going to be seeing how can we utilize the benefits and features of online for that. And we're seeing very clearly online poker. It's the best thing for the country. It's the best thing for individuals that want to play poker, and it is the best thing to ensure protections and safeguards are in place for those that need them.
Thanks, Joey. It's pretty fascinating, isn't it? I mean, where we're at the moment, there's no online poker, there's no live poker for Australian players at this particular moment in time. But it's good to know that there are mechanisations happening in the background, and hopefully, as you say, in a year or so, year and a half, hopefully we are playing online poker in our lounge rooms. So, thanks, Joey. Thanks for joining us again today and filling us in on everything. Thanks, Landon, once again. I know you've got to go catch up with some family, and Joey, I know that you're not going to McDonald's now, so that's good to know.
Never. Yep.
And look, for all the viewers out there, we'll look forward to catching up at the next PMA podcast.
We're on camera the entire time, is that correct?
We are, yes.
Yeah, so don't run around naked or anything.
That's for the PMA podcast After Dark edition. So
okay,
yeah, exactly.
All right, yeah.
Black label.
Subscription only, yeah.